Thanks, Tom. Certainly good to be here today with all of you. Appreciate Steve teaching last week. We were at Rockport with the teenagers for the mission trip. We had 19 of us that went last weekend, and it was a good experience. I think we almost doubled their Sunday morning attendance with all of us who were present. And so we appreciate all the young men and ladies and chaperones who went with us last weekend. Also, I didn't mention this to Tom, just remember we have to leave today. We have to be at Children's Hospital at 1 o'clock. Riley has a Remicade infusion, so we'll be leaving right after services to head there. So we continue to appreciate your prayers with our son's health. I think last week Steve covered 1 Timothy chapter 5, and so this week we want to finish out the book of 1 Timothy. And next week we'll look at an introduction to 2 Timothy, and then we'll get into the text of 2 Timothy in the weeks that follow. And so in 1 Timothy chapter 6, I want to begin by looking first of all at verses 1 through 2. And in that section, there's some admonition, some exhortation to both, to mainly to people who are slaves in the first century and how they should act around their masters in general, and then how they should act specifically if their master is a fellow Christian, and what that relationship should be like with their slave master. I want to talk just a little bit to kind of give us some background on this discussion. How prevalent was slavery in the first century? How prevalent was it in the Roman Empire? Very much so, right? So there's been different estimates. It's hard to know, but maybe anywhere from 25 to 30% of the population were in a slave relationship. And some masters had, dozens, in some cases hundreds of slaves who worked for them. And people treated them, masters treated their slaves in varying degrees, right? Some people treated their slaves like family. Others truly mistreated their slaves. And that's kind of the social order, the social structure that existed in the first century. And it's not an exact parallel, but there are some parallels today. Those of us who work, some of us have really good bosses, supervisors, right? And some of us may not. Or perhaps if we've worked for a number of years, we can recall that we've worked in situations where we had a boss or a foreman or a supervisor who was dictatorial, who was a micromanager, who was difficult to work with. And then we can also recall supervisors that we've had that were great to work for, right? I often see this. People post this a lot on LinkedIn. It says people don't leave their job because of the company. They leave their job because of who? Their boss, right? They leave their job because of their boss. They don't like their boss, and that's why people oftentimes leave organizations. Why didn't Paul and why didn't Jesus just outright come out and say, slavery is evil, and we just need to get rid of slavery, and it's just a bad thing? Why do you think that wasn't said by the New Testament writers? I guess what would have been the repercussions if that would have been said? What would have been what percentage of the population were slaves? A third? What would have been the repercussion if this new religion called Christianity said that slavery shouldn't exist, and that was the social structure of the day? What would have been the repercussions?
It would have been seen as an insurrection against the government.
Absolutely. And what would have probably been the end result? Would we have had maybe some sort of, civil war? What would the name of Christianity look like, right? And so what I want you to see, and a lot of people struggle with this, especially as you think about modern slavery. We think about our country fought a war over slavery, in part over slavery. And no one's saying slavery is a good thing. It isn't a good thing, although I would argue that slavery as a system, as a social order, probably looked a lot different during this time frame than it did in the 1800s here in America and in other parts of the globe. It was the social order that existed at that time. And so basically the instructions that Paul gives Timothy is how to conduct yourself within that social structure. And the comments in verse 1 is that basically if you're a Christian and you're a slave, as many Christians were in the first century, you need to be the best slave you can possibly be. Because ultimately, and then Paul would talk about this to the church at Ephesus, ultimately you're not working for that slave. Who are you working for? You're working for God, right? You're working for Christ. And how are you ever going to win your master to Christ? And that should be a motivator, trying to think if I conduct myself in a certain way, I may win my master to Christ. That'll never happen if you're not a what? An obedient slave, right? Who does what you're supposed to do. Were there masters who were Christians? Yes. Ever heard of the book of Philemon, right? There were masters, and what's kind of interesting too, uninspired church history, it's kind of interesting about the book of Philemon. Uninspired church history tells us that Onesimus, remember, he was a slave that ran away from Philemon. That Onesimus, talk about messing up the social structure, and I think this was the intent. This is what was supposed to happen, and ultimately, in many respects, it did. Onesimus, it is said, served as an elder in the church. So you've got a slave serving as an overseer in a local congregation where some of the members of the congregation were actually what? Masters. And the slaves were serving as elders. And so they were serving as spiritual overseers of masters, and then when they went to work or went back home, then the master was serving as a physical overseer over this elder who was also a slave. Do you think that has a way of breaking down that social structure? Yeah. I mean, that was the ultimate, I think, goal for that to happen. And I think nowhere, we need to be clear that even in the Old Testament, this was the structure that existed, and instructions were given on how to conduct yourself. Now, verse 2 is kind of interesting. It says, so think about this. So you're a Christian, you're a slave, and it just so happens that your master is a Christian. Wow, that's good, right? You would like to think that if your master's a Christian, you're a Christian, he's going to, treat you differently than a non-Christian master. I mean, that should be the case, right? But if you're not careful, there might be a tendency as a slave to what? What might there be a tendency to do? Maybe take advantage of that relationship to say, well, he's a Christian, I can kind of, we're brothers, I mean, I can kind of slack off and not do what I'm maybe supposed to do because we have this bigger thing where we're bonded together as brothers in Christ. And notice what the text says, what Paul says to Timothy in verse 2, and let those who have believers as their masters not be disrespectful to them because they are brethren, but let them serve them all the more, because those who partake of the benefit are believers and beloved teach and preach these principles. In some ways, you should really go out of your way to be the best slave possible because your master is a Christian and you want them to look good and you want to be the kind of Christian slave that they would be proud of. So, obviously we don't have slavery here in America today. Slavery does exist, unfortunately, across the world today in different pockets of the world. Slavery doesn't exist here, but we still have employee-employer relationships. And I've been in situations, I'm trying to think right now if that's the case. I'm trying to draw a blank. I have been in situations where I had employees who were members of the church. I've had situations like that. And so, how do you think when you have Christians who are reporting to you, does that put a special onus upon you as a boss? Do you think in some ways? It should and it shouldn't, right? In some ways, and maybe you've reported to someone who's a member of the church, right? And in any of those situations, you want to make sure that you're definitely being the kind of Christian that God wants you to be. You don't have to answer this unless you really want to, but have you ever worked for somebody who was not a good boss, right? And I see a lot of you kind of, giving me a smile or a shake or something like that. You probably have if you've worked any number of years. Even if you worked fast food once upon a time and you worked in a restaurant or something and you worked for somebody who wasn't all that great. And so the reality is, and this is hard, I think, for us. Even if our boss isn't good, what's the commandment upon us? Obey, right? As to the Lord. Be a good employee. You being a good employee is not dependent upon whether or not your boss is great or not. You being a good employee is dependent upon you being a child of God. That's it. Yeah.
Brian, believe it or not, we had two brothers here one time that way. Mike White was an elder here. But Dave Hammer was high as he was at the job they worked at.
Oh, is that right?
They got along just wonderful.
Well, good. Yeah, you can definitely see how those kinds of situations would happen. I think if I think back, I've noticed some situations where an elder in a congregation actually, one of the members of the congregation was actually their boss in the secular world. So, that actually can occur. Any other comments or questions about this section, verses 1 and 2?
When we think about slaves, we think about a real bad structure, but most of these people, as you've mentioned, were really good. It was just like an employer-employee relationship.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I want to stress that too. And not that we want to kind of dig into all the historical things, but a lot of times when people do think of slavery in the first century, they think of, chains, and they think of, beating someone. And there were cases where that did occur, but by and large, it was a much different structure. I mean, it was almost sort of like, we think of sort of the feudal system that existed like in the medieval times and that kind of thing, where people were kind of dependent upon the landowner for their sustenance and they worked for him and that kind of thing. So it was a different system than kind of what led to our Civil War system that we had here in America at one time. So it's important to kind of, I think, make those distinctions. Any other comments about that? Okay, let's look at verses. This is kind of a big section here. And this isn't uncommon, and you know this, that when you used to write a letter, if you still write letters, that if you're writing a letter to someone, and maybe it's several pages long, towards the end of it, you start to sometimes ramble a little bit, right? You just kind of throw in a lot of things. And so there's not a real sequence here. I mean, there's just a lot of things kind of put in. It is the conclusion of the letter to Timothy, and so it just kind of has a lot of, I don't want to say a hodgepodge, but it's a variety of things that Paul wants to make sure he gets in as he finishes out this letter. And so this is kind of verses 3 through 16. It's an exhortation to live godly and an exhortation to being content. And he says in verse 3, if anyone advocates a different doctrine and does not agree with sound words, those of our Lord Jesus Christ, and that word sound means healthy words, and with the doctrine conforming to godliness, what kind of person is that? Well, Paul makes a judgment call here. He says in verse 4, that person is conceited and understands nothing, but he has a morbid interest in controversial questions and disputes about words, out of which arise envy, strife, abusive language, evil suspicions. And he kind of goes on. I really like this. There's some rich words here that Paul uses. Now, the New American Standard says morbid interest in controversial questions. That word morbid conveys unhealthy, sick, a diseased interest in. All right? So this is the kind of person who just has sort of a sick interest in controversy. Now, I'm kind of jumping ahead here on some of my questions at the end of the lesson, but do you know people? Don't think about church for just a moment. Think about work. Do you know some people who just have a diseased interest in controversy?
Is a counseling term for it? They're combatant.
Absolutely.
It's not just a normal combatant. There's something wrong.
They just always are striving on controversy, right? If you say it's red, it's green, right? Just a constant, they just want to stir up controversy all the time. And I think it's really interesting here. You know, this may cause more controversy, but you may think it in your mind. I don't know if you should actually verbalize it to the person. But as you look at that person, how they behave, you can think to yourself, they're diseased. And they are, in a sense. They have a diseased interest in controversy and disputes about words. Verse 5 says, constant friction between men of depraved mind, deprived of the truth, who suppose that godliness is a means of gain. Now, there's a line of thought here, and a lot of times we've taken these scriptures kind of out of context and not kind of followed the line of thought. Godliness as a means of gain. Who are we talking about? False teachers, right? False teachers who have this diseased interest in controversy, and they see religion, that's godliness here, I think, they see religion as a means of gain. Are there false teachers who line their wallets because of their false teaching? Yes. So it's just kind of interesting. I'm going to give you a big example, then I'm going to bring an example home. So here's the big example. So I know you've heard of Joel Osteen, right? You know, and sometimes I'll watch him on television, and his wife Victoria, and his church in, I think it's in Houston, is where the Houston Rockets used to play. I mean, it's been converted into a church, and I don't know, 30,000 people or something, some crazy number of people gathered together in multiple services on Sunday to hear Joel Osteen preach. He seems like a nice guy. I mean, he seems, affable. Joel Osteen lives in a $10.5 million house, 17,000 square feet, with a guest house and a pool house. All right? And his net worth, anybody want to take a guess what his net worth is? $40 million. Okay, $40 million. So notice what Paul says. Godliness, religion, false teachers, is a means of what? Gain, right? Is a means of gain. Now, he supposedly, until I think 2005, drew a salary of $200,000 a year, but he foregoes that salary. How noble of him, because now he makes all of his money off of speaking appearances and books and things like that, and that's where he has his net worth of $40 million. Has he made his money off of religion? Yes, absolutely. Now, to bring it home a little bit, ever heard of a church called Crossroads Church here in Cincinnati? Right? They're one of the top, I think they're the 18th largest mega churches in the United States. They have 20,000 people who gathered all their campuses or their franchise sites across greater Cincinnati every Sunday. And it's kind of interesting, if you look on their website, it basically talks about ownership. They have like owners. It's a church with like an ownership board. They own the place. And it is a business. And there's actually been some interviews in some business journals. Brian, who is the head minister there, talks about how they're very business savvy and they're very much into PR and marketing and that kind of thing. And so, I don't know what. And then I went on their website actually to see how much their ministers make, and it says that we don't tell that to anybody. We have an aggregate of what all of our staff make, but we don't want to promote jealousy, so we don't tell what anybody makes. So that was kind of interesting. So, again, are there people who are into false teaching for gain, right? Some of you are old enough, most of you are old enough to remember Jim and Tammy who? Baker, right? Remember that? Remember the doghouse that was air conditioned? Remember that? Remember that? So again, making all kinds of money propagating false teaching. So that's where Paul then kind of says in verse 6, but godliness actually is a means of great gain, but not the kind of gain that these people want. We're talking about having a true, valid relationship with God. That is a means of great gain when it's accompanied by contentment. Okay? So what is contentment? Boy, that's a tough one, right? Because oftentimes in our society, once we say, once I get this, I'll be good, right? Whatever this is. Maybe it's a new watch, or maybe it's a a new car, or a new house, or whatever it is, or a new video game or whatever. But once we get it, what? How long does that last? Not long, right? And then we're what? It's the next thing we want to get, right? It's always something, right, that we want to enhance ourselves with. But verse 7, Paul reminds us, for we brought nothing into this world, and what? We can take nothing out of it. There's a physician that I'm kind of friends with. We email every once in a while. He's a palliative physician down in South Carolina. And I should have brought a picture of it. I have it in my email somewhere. He showed me somebody's gravestone. It was somebody in Russia who died. And he was wealthy. And his gravestone, it's this huge monument, and it's a replica of his Mercedes-Benz and a replica of him, and it's got some wording on there. And it's just ironic because, you have these great monuments and statues, but you really can't take it with you. And, you've all heard this before, but you've never seen, and I think there's a country music song about this too, surprise, right? That you've never seen a U-Haul trailer behind a hearse, right? Because you just simply can't take it with you. You came in with nothing, and you'll leave with nothing. No matter how fancy your funeral is, you're still going to turn to dust, right? When it's all said and done, you can spend a lot of money to have yourself embalmed, and you can last so long, but even that is only good for so long. Verse 8 says, "If we have food and covering, with these we'll be content." It's kind of interesting in the original language. That word food means, it kind of goes beyond food. It means the means of providing food. So typically, what's the means of providing our food? A job, right? So if I have a job, and then it says clothing, and it kind of goes to the means of providing clothing, the concept is shelter. So here's what it's saying. If I got a job, if I'm able to provide for myself, and I have a place to live, with these things, I should really be content, right? I don't need all the extras. And what's funny is sometimes the extras we try to get in life, we try to do that to impress people who at the end of the day really don't even care, do they? We try to impress people and they really don't care about those kinds of things. Casey and I have been talking just a little bit about a car at some point, getting a new car, and we've been saying, what should we get? And we're just trying to say what can make us content. What's about being content? I think those are important questions that we need to ask ourselves. Verse 9, "But those who want to get rich," and really the original concept is here in the original language is those who are obsessed with a desire to become rich. They're just obsessed with it. And obviously if you're obsessed with getting rich, if that's your obsession, you're going to neglect your what? Your spirituality, right? You're going to neglect your soul if your obsession is with getting rich. And as it says, those who do fall into temptation and a snare and many foolish and harmful desires which plunge men into ruin and destruction. Now, verse 10, as you know, is a verse that's been misquoted many times, and we probably work with people who will misquote this verse. They'll often say, money is the root of all evil, right? You hear that a lot. Money is the root of all evil. That's not the quote, right? Because do we need money? Yes. Money puts food on the table. Money pays the rent. Money pays the mortgage. In fact, in a few moments, we're actually going to ask you to what? Give some money, right? So money is not bad. We need money, okay? The problem is when money is our God, when we love money and we're obsessed about money, and it's all about how much money we can get into our hands. And I think it's kind of interesting. In verse 11, it says, "But flee these things," that we've just been talking about. "Flee, you man of God." And, it's kind of interesting. I think, Timothy's a preacher, and he's called a man of God. I think that applies to all of us, but especially those who preach the word. They have beautiful feet, we're told, and they also are men of God. So flee, but also what? Pursue. Some people have written shun and run, right? So the concept is, if we're going to be a man of God, we have to flee certain things. But if we just flee certain things and don't pursue certain things, what's going to happen to that empty spot? It's going to be filled with things we don't want it to be filled with. So we need to flee wrong things, but that's not enough. It's not just to say, I don't do these things. We've got to pursue righteous things. And so you've got to think about in your life, what are you doing to pursue righteous things? It's not enough just to say, well, I shun. What are you doing to run towards something? Well, I don't do these things. Well, that's good. I don't go to those kind of places. I don't watch those kind of things. I don't listen to those kind of things. But what are you pursuing? How are you pursuing righteousness? Now, let me say something. All of you that are here this morning in Bible class, you've come an hour earlier. Some folks won't be here till the next hour. Some people won't be here because of health reasons and things like that, or work schedules. But you're here because you are pursuing. You're pursuing righteousness. Otherwise, you'd be at Cracker Barrel right now, right? Or you'd be at Frisch's, or you'd be doing something else.
So this is coming at a really good time. I happen to be in a situation where I feel like I have one of those bosses. So
Okay.
I want to ask some questions, and so I understand, and I've kind of stopped pushing back on everything. Just being the way I'm supposed to be, hopefully. But if you have the opportunity, I don't get involved in controversies. I don't, push back when things are going the wrong way. But if you have the opportunity to how long should you stay in a situation if you have opportunities to, maybe just move laterally to a different direction? And how long do you endure things that you think aren't good when you have an opportunity maybe to serve in a different way? Or do you just stick it out, where you're at?
I'll give you two answers to that. The first answer is, and then I'll give you a more practical answer. When you were a slave in the first century, could you switch bosses? So it was incumbent upon you to try to make the best of the situation. Now, today we're very fortunate, right? Most of us aren't indentured, right? And so we talked about that earlier. Why do people leave jobs? It's not because of the company, it's because of the boss, right? And so I think that, and I'm giving you opinion. This is Brian chapter 12, verse 6, right? This is an opinion here. I think you've got to do also, if you have the ability to be flexible and move into a different role, which is going to allow you to be most pursuant of righteousness. You know what I mean? And if you're the kind of person that you go to work every day and you dread going to work, does that affect your demeanor? Does that affect how you interact with other people? Absolutely. And so if you're in a situation where, and does it affect you at home? It can, right? Because you feel awful, you dread it, and you bring that over to your home life. And I think if you're in a situation where you can either, not necessarily like you said, like a lateral move, not even, bettering yourself financially or whatever, or promotionally, it's more about, I just got to get out of the situation. It's not good for me spiritually. I don't like the kind of person I'm having to be under this person, And I think everybody has to kind of make those decisions. And probably many of us through the years have either done lateral moves in an organization, or we've done career changes, or we've moved jobs. It's kind of interesting. I'm going to pick on Bill for just a minute. And don't be offended, Bill. Bill's of a different generation, right? And so Bill's sort of like my father-in-law, who also, my father-in-law retired from General Motors. And how many years did people work at places like that? 35, 40 years, But generations today, do you work, today somebody who's graduating from high school and goes off to college and they get their first job, how likely is it that they're going to spend their entire career there? How likely is that? Very unlikely. Very unlikely. And part of the reason people move is because of, I've got to find a better situation for myself. But that's hard, isn't it? Like we said, it is hard to be in a situation. But as long as you find yourself in that situation, until you can, God commends you for being that employee that you need to be. And that is hard. It's hard, and you have every right in a work relationship. Most of us work in jobs where we have ways to communicate, and there are forums, and and there are surveys, and there are engagement surveys, and there are employee satisfaction surveys, and there are ways we can give feedback and things like that. But if we've exhausted those and the situation isn't good, I think sometimes for our own spirituality, sometimes we have to look in a different direction. Definitely.
Brian, politically, most people are going to find themselves in this country under a situation where they want to move laterally and they can't because of whoever the president will be. And we have examples like Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, or Nelson Mandela, who were under severe situations they couldn't move laterally or anyway, and they found contentment. And I think no matter what it is, we have to find contentment in those situations.
Yeah, because that's a good point, because and we all know that some people, because of whatever reason, maybe because of lack of education, where they're stuck in a job. They don't like it, and they can't really advance because they don't have, there are ways people can go back to school, and everybody can do that. And so it's like you got to make the best of it, right? And you've got to be true to your Christianity in whatever situation you find yourself. Absolutely, that's a great point. And it makes it, this is so true, the scriptures speak of that, right? It makes it harder to not like someone when every night you're praying for them. You're praying for their family. You're praying for the situation that you find yourself in. That's a great point. All right, so let's talk here a little bit about, we talked about the flee and pursue. We have to have both concepts. And then it's kind of interesting. I've got on here the Christian jihad. Now, that's a word you typically hear in Islamic circles, right? The word jihad means holy war. It means a struggle. It means a fight. But from a Christian perspective, are we in a fight? Yes, we've got to fight the good fight. And, when I think about a fight, that's a strong word to me, right? When you think about... And when you think about the things that you have to face, it is a fight, right? The good fight of faith, because so many things are against us. Maybe our boss is against us. It may be, our culture is against us. Our society is against us. Maybe good friends we've had in the past maybe are against us in terms of the kind of things we believe in our spirituality. We've got to fight the good fight. And it seems kind of relevant as we think about the Olympics and struggling and fighting and keeping on going. We just can't give up. Last night, Casey and I were watching, and I'm the 10,000 meter or whatever it was, where they go around the track like 25 times or whatever. And the guy who won actually fell down in the middle of the race. And he got up, and he just ran. And the Kenyans were trying to prevent him from winning, right? And he won. He fought the good fight. And our Christian life is the fight, and we just have to keep on going. And he had some scratches on his shoulder when he fell down. You just have to. You're going to get scratches along the way, and you're going to get chigger bites along the way, and all kinds of things. You just got to get up, and you got to keep on fighting every day for our beliefs and for Christianity. So let's just drop down to verses 17 through 19. Here's an exhortation to the rich. It's kind of interesting. It's not really a denunciation of being wealthy. It really is saying that when you have wealth, it comes with accountability. It comes with responsibility. It says if you're rich, it's important that you not be conceited or that you not fix your hope on your riches. As you get older and maybe you have a retirement account and you're accumulating some money in the bank, sometimes if you're not careful, you become dependent upon that, and you think, look at this, I've got some money, and but wealth can be lost instantly through a variety of circumstances. And we can't fix our hope on a 401k or a 403b or a pension fund or how much money is in the savings account, and it might be $10,000 or $100,000. We can't allow that we can't allow ourselves to be dependent upon that. Instruct them to be good, to be rich in good works, and be generous and ready to share. If you've been blessed, you have a responsibility to what? Be a blessing. You need to give back. God has blessed you. And so, I think about in our life, God has blessed us. And so how can we give back? And what can we do? And what good causes, in addition to our contribution here at church, our financial contribution, what other ways can we help out, good works for the blessings that we have received. And then finally, the last section, I wrote that wrong. It should be 20 through 21. I transposed those numbers. It's kind of interesting. I like this wording here, verse 20. "O Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you." That word entrusted, it really conveys a deposit. Timothy, you are guarding a deposit. Okay? Now think about this. This makes me think of one of my favorite movies of all time, It's a Wonderful Life. Remember that movie? And remember that, I forget his name, somebody probably knows it, the clerk who goes to Potter's bank, remember that? And he's got the deposit and he loses it. And of course Potter's bad and he takes the money. He lost it. That which was entrusted to him to deposit. He was supposed to guard it and he lost that money. And so if you've ever been in a position where you've had to take money to the bank, maybe here at church, or you work in a business and you have to make a deposit of the company's profits for the night, you're entrusted to it. And that's what Paul says to Timothy. You've got to entrust yourself. You've got to guard this deposit. This is valuable. You share it with others, but you've got to guard the purity of it. You've got to make sure it's not corrupted. You've got to make sure that false teachers don't get in and mess it up, that they don't teach things that aren't found within it. You've been entrusted to it. So you think about that. We're all brinksmen, right? We've got to guard this. And elders have to guard this, and preachers have to guard this, and all of us as members, we need to know what false teaching is so we can guard against the deposit that has been entrusted to us. And we have to avoid false knowledge and empty chatter. Is this true? Will people believe all sorts of crazy things? They will. And even things that are so-called in the name of religion, right? People believe. You know, every once in a while, we drop our dog off at the lady who watches our dog, and she lives in Florence near the Scientology church. You know, there in Florence, used to be a Baptist church building. And I'm like, people believe, there's always lots of people out there. I'm like, people believe this stuff. It's, you know, the guy who started Scientology, he was like a science fiction comic strip guy. You know what I mean? And like Isaac Asimov. And all these people believe all this crazy stuff. You know, why is that? People will believe all kinds of things. And so we have to guard against that. Let's look at the questions real quick. I know we don't have a lot of time here. So again, does the Bible commend or condemn slavery? The Bible wanted Christians to live within that social structure, and eventually it would dissolve itself. And it did, in large part. It's dissolved itself. Why do some people like controversy? Well, we've kind of talked about that, haven't we? Why is contentment so hard to attain? Why is Christianity called a fight? We've talked about that. And why is being rich a challenge to spirituality? We've kind of talked about those things. Let's go ahead and bow for a word of prayer. Our Father in heaven, we're so thankful for this opportunity to be here today to study your word. We're thankful for the words that have been preserved from the Apostle Paul to Timothy in chapter 6. We pray we might take these things to heart, and we pray, most importantly, God, that we might truly guard this deposit that's been entrusted to us, and that we'll share it with others, but we will preserve its integrity. Be with us during our worship hour as Neville speaks to us, that we may learn and we may grow as a result of being here, and we may worship you and be edified. We ask all these things in Christ's name. Amen.